What are the goals in managing an overall economy? The first goal is to achieve stable economic growth. That is, we have stable increases in GDP over time, price stability, an inflation rate of between 2 and 3%. We aim for that. That was decided in the 1980s as the target range for inflation. Low unemployment. So we want the unemployment rate to be around about the natural rate, which is, by most estimates, roughly speaking, 5%. So kind of an important lesson of just one of these macroeconomic policy goals is that the government will try and make sure there's a fairly stable level of unemployment. It uses unemployment in part to control inflation. If you ever wonder, why doesn't the government try and get the unemployment rate to zero? It doesn't want the unemployment rate to be zero, because if it were zero, wage demands would be much higher, cost of production would be much higher, firms would charge higher prices, and then you would have inflation. So they don't want that to be the case. And external stability. The Reserve Bank or the government is fine to let the value of the Australian dollar fluctuate day to day, week to week, month to month, but it would never want the value of the Australian dollar to collapse. And so if that were to occur, then the government or the Reserve Bank might intervene. By and large, the government and the Reserve Bank leave the exchange rate alone, and it does whatever it does according to supply and demand. If we look at our first goal, stable economic growth. If we imagined that a business cycle looks something like this is obviously a stylized business cycle, it's not a real business cycle, where we've got a peak, the economy is growing, it reaches a peak, then it crashes, output falls till you reach the bottom, then it starts to, output rises again, reaches a peak, falls again. So this is our business cycle. On average, there's economic growth. If we drew a line of best fit, then you've got on average, output's going up. But we don't want it on average to be going up in this fluctuating way. We want it to go up in a stable way. We want the actual output to at least approximate an average. So we would want this to be smoothed. So how do we smooth the business cycle? Well, in the short term, one of the reasons for an economy booming and one of the reasons for an economy slumping is because of fluctuations in aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand for goods and services. Investment expenditure is very volatile, and net export expenditure can also be very volatile. And they can, for example, expand rapidly, which causes a boom, but they can also contract rapidly, which can cause a recession. So the government would want to use instruments or levers at its control to stabilise aggregate demand for goods and services. One instrument or lever is interest rates. So this is monetary policy. The Reserve Bank of Australia can manipulate interest rates, which can affect aggregate demand. In particular, changing interest rates affects consumption spending for durable goods. It affects investment spending, that is the borrowing by businesses to build new factories and offices and more equipment. And net exports are affected by interest rates as well. Interest rates affect the exchange rate, and the exchange rate affects net exports. So monetary policy can influence these three types of expenditure to try and smooth things out, to try and dampen down fluctuations, either up or down. And the other lever, the government can use fiscal policy. And that basically boils down to government spending and taxation revenue. Government spending obviously affects government spending, G, that's straightforward. How does tax revenue affect this equation, C plus I plus G plus NX? Changes in income tax affect households' incomes. So if you change income tax, you change households' incomes. If you change households' incomes, what gets affected? Consumption spending by households. So the Reserve Bank and the government have these levers at its disposal to manipulate aggregate demand, and in particular, these particular components of aggregate demand. So we've got our peaks and our troughs. So what we're trying to aim for here is we want to push down the peak. We charge high interest rates. If there's a boom happening, lots of expenditure occurring in the economy, too much expenditure occurring in the economy, inflation might be starting to get out of control, above the 2 to 3% acceptable range. The Reserve Bank steps in and it pushes up interest rates. Pushing up interest rates makes it more expensive to borrow. Households borrow less money. Businesses borrow less money for spending. Net exports fall, which causes the boom to be not as big as it would have been. So we cut the top off what would have been the peak of the business cycle. What about the trough? The economy were to go into recession because there's not enough spending in the economy. Businesses are not spending enough on investment. Households are not spending enough on consumer goods. Maybe net export revenue has fallen. And so the economy has gone into recession. Unemployment has gone up. Inflation is now too low. The government might say what we need to do is we need to eliminate this recession. In fact, we want to preemptively eliminate it. So the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates, makes it cheaper to borrow by households and by firms so they can spend more. And the government says we're going to increase government spending and we might decrease taxes. So aggregate demand becomes higher than it would have been, and so we cut the bottom off the trough. And we do the same thing at the next peak and trough. And so we would now have a business cycle, assuming everything went according to plan, and this actually worked, and we timed it right, then we would get a business cycle that was much less peaky and troughy. In the ideal case, you would even want it to be like this. That would be even better, more stable. So let's go back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, because we're going to use that to understand monetary policy and fiscal policy and its operation on the economy as a whole. We've got aggregate demand for goods and services, and that aggregate demand for goods and services is determined by consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. And we've got aggregate supply, and that is determined by the prices of inputs and the productivity of inputs. The economy is in equilibrium where the aggregate demand for goods and services in a given year is equal to the aggregate supply of those goods and services in a given year for the economy as a whole. We're not interested in any particular industry, any particular types of goods, just the total number of goods and services produced in the economy as a whole. So that equilibrium is at the intersection of these two curves. At that point, the aggregate demand for goods and services is at Y1, and the aggregate supply of goods and services is also at Y1. That occurs at the price level of P1, and we will assume that the economy tends to gravitate towards that equilibrium. Independent of prices, the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve, can shift because of a change in, I should add to that, net exports, because of a change in consumption spending or investment spending or net government spending or net exports. So the aggregate demand curve can shift to the right if those types of expenditure increase, aggregate demand increases, shifts right. If any of those decrease, then aggregate demand shifts left, it decreases. And now looking at the supply curve, if input prices change, now input prices are things like wage rates, that is the price of labour. If wage rates change, or the price of essential raw materials change, then aggregate supply will shift. How will it shift? It will either shift upwards or downwards. If wage rates rise, then the cost of producing a given amount of output will increase. To produce Y1, if wage rates rise, firms could charge this price, but at higher wage rates, they have to charge higher prices. At this output level, they'd have to charge higher prices. So the aggregate supply curve would shift up to reflect the higher prices of the inputs used to produce goods and services. And of course, the opposite is true. If wage rates fall across the country, then the cost of production falls across the country, and the cost, and therefore the aggregate supply curve, shifts downwards to reflect lower input prices.